Hi, I'm Christy and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm here with all of my favorite historical reads of 2024. Alright, I can't believe that we are already to the end of 2024, or just about to the end. I'm filming all of my content ahead of time, and I just can't believe that I'm already wrapping up all of my favorites of the year. So when I was looking at my calendar and planning out my content, planning out my videos, I realized I have a ton that I want to wrap up for the end of the year. So this video was going to be 2 videos, but I think I'm just going to combine it into one and just have favorite historical reads of 2024. And so it's just going to be my favorite historical fiction and my favorite historical romance reads into one video. Just because I'm running out of days in the year to post all of these, I'm already going to be having videos at the end of the year, like every other day, just because I have so much content that I now want to make at the end of the year. So that is just what we're going to do today. I think I have about 20 to recommend, and I'm so excited to chat about all of them. It actually kind of works out because I am a co-host to 2 different book clubs, one of which is a historical fiction book club, and the other one is a historical romance book club. So I feel like this works out perfectly and is totally on brand for, you know, both of my book clubs and all the things and all the historical reads that I like. So without further ado, let's just jump into these because, like I said, I have just about 20, maybe 21 to talk about and recommend today. As always, if you ever want to see more of my thoughts or my full reviews on any of the books that I'm about to talk about, any of the books that I ever read, I do review every book that I read on Goodreads, and you can always get to my Goodreads linked in the description of the video. Down in the description of the video, you're also going to find that I always link all of the books, all of the authors that I talk about in all of my videos. So that way, if you miss one and want to go back and see which book or author I was talking about, they're all linked in the description of the video in order of when I talked about them. So all of that out of the way, let's get into it. All right, I think I'm just going to mix it up. So it's going to be historical fiction and historical romance together. So first up is The Women by Kristin Hannah. I love Kristin Hannah's historical fictions so much. This was one of my reads early on in the year. It came out in February and it was one of my favorites. It's one of my favorites of the year. I love this book so much. If you haven't picked up Kristin Hannah's historical fictions, I highly recommend her books. This one in particular, we are following women, or a particular woman in the story, and we are following her through Vietnam War. So she joins as a nurse because her brother is fighting in the war as well, and she decides to join up and be a part of it. And then we get to see her journey through being a nurse over there during the war, and then when she comes back as well. Most of the story is after the fact and just the PTSD, the trauma, the lack of support that she's receiving from pretty much everyone in the country, her family, medical professionals, all the things, like the lack of support and help and healthcare that they were giving to people coming back from the war, especially women. And so it's just such a strong, powerful story. I love this one at 2 pieces. So emotional. It's definitely one that has stuck with me all year long. Highly recommend. I always love Kristin Hannah's historical fictions, but this is definitely one of my favorites from her. All right, another historical fiction that I love this year is Take My Hand by Dolene Perkins Valdez. I love this one. I just read it actually in November, and it is definitely one that is going to stick with me. So this book takes place in dual timeline, and we follow a character in present day, and then we also see flashbacks of her story from being in post-segregation Alabama in 1973. She was a Black nurse working at a family planning clinic, and so the story is definitely hard-hitting and heavy with things kind of going on in the country still today. This one immediately pulled me into the story. I was obsessed with the author's writing. I could tell immediately, like a few chapters in, this was going to be a 5-star read for me. It's just so powerful. I'm obsessed with her writing. I want to go back and read like all of her books now because her writing was just amazing, and the story itself was so powerful as well. So we see the main character in here. She is a new nurse, and she's kind of just taking on her tasks and doing the things that are doled out to her. And then one of her first cases are 2 patients. They're 11 and 13, and she's tasked with giving them birth control. And so it makes her start to question, why is she doing this? What's going on? And just some other things come into play. So this is a book that is inspired by true events that happened in our nation, and we're following the nurse who became the whistleblower on this huge case. Like I mentioned, this is definitely a heavy hitter of a story. It's a story of institutional racism and classism, reproductive injustice, and the US government's history with horrifying overreach and dealing with women's reproductive rights as well. I connected to the story and the characters so much, was just so pulled in by the author's writing and the story that she was telling. Like I said, it's definitely an emotional, hard-hitting book, but I feel like it's just such a powerful story and a powerful little glimpse or inspired by history as well, and pulls into other events that have happened in our kind of more recent past as well for this country. So yeah, definitely such a great read. I want to read so many more books from this author, one of my favorites of the year. All right, so now jumping into a historical romance. So this is Queen Charlotte, and this is by Julia Quinn and Shonda Rhimes. So Julia Quinn is of course from Bridgerton fame, and this story is kind of exists in the Bridgerton world, or the Bridgerton world that was created from the Netflix TV show, which is what she collabed with Shonda Rhimes, and so they ended up writing this story together, which became a Netflix adaptation itself of Queen Charlotte. I love this one to pieces. This is actually my favorite thing that they've done on Netflix. I love this one to pieces. So emotional. These last couple books in particular are all ones that made me cry, and they just like stick with you. This book in particular is kind of the fictionalized tale of Queen Charlotte and King George and their relationship and marriage, and mostly focuses on Queen Charlotte's relationship with George, her husband, also with some of her family members and friends. And it's just one that I absolutely love. Of course, there are a ton of hardships in their relationship, in their marriage, and King George's life, and I just loved seeing the glimpse of that. If you've watched the Queen Charlotte adaptation, then you kind of are going to know exactly the story that's going on here. I will say in the Queen Charlotte Netflix show, they focus more on kind of having the Bridgerton family involved, or Violet Bridgerton in particular. In the book, she's not present at all, which I kind of appreciated more. But you do get Queen Charlotte, King George, you get, of course, Lady Danbury, and some of their friends and the people that they work with as well. Love this one so much. Very much bittersweet kind of romance, but it's just so beautiful, and I love the story so much. All right, and then we actually have 3, or I guess 4. I don't have the other book with me. My parents are borrowing it right now. So this is the Perez Family series by Chanel Cleeton. I went on a binge of Chanel Cleeton's historical fiction books this past fall and loved them so much, was so obsessed, have read them all. I have a whole author guide to her books on my channel, so I'll link that in the description of the video. And yeah, let's get into these and talk about them. So first up is the first book in the Perez Family series. So this is Next Year in Havana. This is the first one that I started with, and it's honestly a great place to start to get into her historical fictions. Basically in here, we're following the Perez family, and we are seeing dual timelines. So this author loves to write dual timeline of present day and then going to the past as well. She writes really beautiful history in here, and the characters are super interesting and just fast-paced that pulls you into the story immediately. And she always has like romances in here as well, which I appreciate. So in here, we're following a granddaughter whose grandmother recently passed away, and so her grandmother pretty much raised her after her parents divorced. She moved in with her grandmother and lived with her in Florida, and her grandmother always told her these beautiful stories of her life in Havana and Cuba before her family had to end up leaving Cuba and coming to America in the 50s. And so the granddaughter is really pulled to going to Cuba and seeing all these beautiful places that her grandmother talked about over the years. She is a travel writer, kind of blogger, so she's able to access Cuba and go there for work as well. So she ends up going there, and when she gets there, she ends up meeting her grandmother's best friend's grandson. So those two kind of connect, and they kind of both delve into their family histories. Some family secrets are unveiled, and it kind of goes from there in the present day. And then in the past timeline, we follow the grandmother and her story of when she was a younger girl and her family was wealthy. Her father was a sugar baron, and they lived a very sheltered, kind of naive life to the politics and things that were happening in Cuba during the time. And so when the whole political unrest happened in Cuba, her family ended up leaving and moving to the US. So we see her in that last year of Cuba and kind of falling into a kind of forbidden relationship with somebody who was more of a rebel. And so it kind of goes from there. I loved how both of the timelines intersected and intertwined, and it was just such a powerful story, which, like I said, led me down a binge of all of this author's historical fictions, so highly recommend. So then the second book of the series is When We Left Cuba, and this is following one of the other sisters from the Perez family. So this one takes place in the 1960s, and it has this espionage kind of spy story to it. And so this one as well is told in dual timeline, but in this one we get the same character, her POVs in both timelines. So we see her in present day as well as back in her past in the 60s. Basically in here, she has some really hard feelings with having to leave Cuba, and she has a lot of hard feelings towards Fidel Castro and kind of some things that had to do with her brother as well, which you see kind of explored in the story. And so in here, the heroine ends up getting recruited by the CIA to infiltrate Fidel Castro's inner circle and kind of share secrets with the CIA and things that are happening there. So like I said, I just really appreciate Chanel Cleeton's history that she writes into her books. This one in particular is dealing with a lot of the Cuban-American politics during the 1960s. We see kind of the beginning of the Cold War, the Bay of Pigs, JFK, him becoming president, and kind of all the things that happened there with his presidency, and just kind of all of these things. So yeah, really love this one as well. And like I said, you get a love story as well. All right, book 3 in the Perez series is The Last Train to Key West. This is my favorite in the series. I love it so much. This one's a little different because we don't get dual timeline and we're not following any of the direct Perez family sisters. We do have some Perez family members in here, but we jump back in time to the 1930s. So this story really heavily centers around the 1935 Labor Day hurricane that happened in Florida. It was the strongest storm at the time in recorded history, where it actually landed on US soil. And so we kind of see 3 different characters, 3 different women. They all have different things going on, but they're all in the same place at the same time. And so we follow all of their 3 stories. You see how they kind of connect and how they're in the, just like I said, the same place. And we see this Labor Day hurricane that is happening, which was a Category 5, I think, before they categorized them, but it was a Category 5 storm that hit. And we also see some World War I veterans who were working on a road road system down there at the time. Such a heavy hitter of a book. I love this one. 2 pieces, highly recommend. All right, and then the last one in the Perez family series, because there are 5 books in the series. This is book 5, so this is Our Last Days in Barcelona. Again, this is by Chanel Clayton. I love this one so much. So this book actually really connects to book 2, which was When We Left Cuba. So basically this one takes place right where this one left off. So like I said, the sister in here was a spy, kind of doing her espionage thing, and she ended up going to Barcelona at one point in the story. So this book picks up with another sister going to follow the other one's trail and try to find where she's at in Barcelona. But when she gets there, she finds her sister's apartment empty, and she finds a man who is there looking for her sister as well. And so they end up kind of teaming up to try to figure out what's going on. The heroine in here also learns some family secrets. She learns that she was in Barcelona as a child and had no idea, and her mother kind of lied to her about it. And so we kind of see her figuring out things from there. So that timeline's in 1964, and then we flash back to the 1930s. I want to say like 1936 is when we're following her mother's story in Barcelona after some things happened with her husband, and it kind of goes from there. So in the 1930s timeline, we get the Civil War kind of unrest happening in Spain at the time. And like I said, the history is just so good. Highly recommend her books. Love them so much. Just so good, especially this series. All right, next up is historical romance. So this is The Wickedness of a Highlander by Elisa Braden. This is book 4 in her Midnight in Scotland series. First of all, these covers are just absolutely stunning. Love them so much. This book was a long time coming, so I'm so glad that it did finally release earlier this year. This one's so good. I will say this series in particular is best to read in order because you're following kind of the familiar characters and families that you've already seen and kind of plots that have already happened in the other books in the series. So in this one, the heroine is kind of wanting to make amends for things that her brother did in a previous book. So she's traveling to Scotland to make amends and kind of apologize to one of the families there that he kind of affected. So when she gets there though, the only member of that family is the hero, and he's the one who hates her the most, or so she thinks. This series just has really great grumpy, broody Scottish heroes. So yeah, this one was a historical romance new release this year. I love Elisa Braden's writing. Highly recommend checking her out. She is an indie historical romance author. I have read all of her historical romances, love them to pieces, and this one was such a great release of the year. All right, next up is Last Christmas in Paris by Hazel Gaynor and Heather Webb. Like I said, I'm a co-host for a historical fiction book club, and so our Leave It to the Pros book club, which the Instagram is linked in the description if you ever want to join and check out any of our monthly reads and join us. This one was our December pick, and it was so amazing, so good. Probably one of my favorites of the year. It just really stuck with me. This one, it takes place during World War I, and so we're following 4 different years from 1914 all the way to 1918, as well as a flash forward into, I want to say, like the 1960s. So this entire story is an epistolary story, which means it is told through letters, and we see telegrams and newspaper articles that some of the characters are writing in, and that is how the entire story is told. I'm somebody who loves epistolary stories, and this book just hit so hard. I cried so many times during this book. Even talking about this book after the fact, I cried again. I love it so much. It left such an impression on me. Like I said, it's during World War I, following basically this core of 4 characters. The main character, we'll just say, is one heroine, and then you see her relationship with her brother, who has joined up in World War I, and then his best friend, and then the heroine's best friend as well, who becomes a nurse during World War I. And they're all British, and you see their thoughts of kind of going into the war, of what they thought it was going to be, and then finding out what it became. Definitely a hard-hitting book, very emotional, but just like pulls you in with the storytelling through the letters. Loved it, 2 pieces. Highly recommend checking it out. This was my first time reading either of these authors, and I want to go like read all of their books because this one just hit so hard. It's also just such a beautiful cover. Just love it to pieces. So beautiful. So yeah, definitely check this one out as well. World War I historical fiction. All right, next up is The Gift by Julie Garwood. First of all, the pink on here is just absolutely stunning. I wish they brought back these gorgeous historical romance covers. So like I mentioned earlier, I am a co-host for a historical romance book club as well, which is Historical Hellions. And basically we read historical romances published before the year 2000. Again, we have an Instagram and it is linked in the description of my video. So you can go check out our reads for 2025 and maybe join us as well on this journey. So this was our January pick, and it was our first read of the year, and I loved this one so stinking much. It was probably one of my favorites that we read this year. This one, we basically see that the heroine is a child bride to somebody. That's kind of how the story starts off, and then you see years later what has come to be with these characters, and they haven't been in one another's lives for years, but now they are back in the same place for reasons. So basically the beginning of the story is the hero coming to kind of abduct the heroine and take her with him for reasons, and you see that the heroine, she's very feisty and sassy and spirited, which I loved about her. She's a bit naive, but I feel like in a charming, like in endearing way. Like it made sense for her character, why she's so naive for the time. And so anyways, she wants to escape and go on these grand adventures. And so she is looking to run away the night that the hero comes to abduct her. And so it kind of works out for him. He sees her kind of sneaking away and he decides, you know what, I'm going to follow her, like see what she's up to. It's just so much fun. Absolutely obsessed with the characters in here. The heroine, like I said, she's naive, but in that like fumbling, endearing, really sweet way. And she really tries her best. So they end up on a ship together. And I loved in here how the heroine is just determined to kind of help everybody on board, but she makes a lot of mistakes along the way, messes things up, causes problems. It's just like wreaks havoc, but she's really trying her best and just wants to make everybody happy. I love this one to pieces. If you can't tell, like it just puts a smile on my face thinking about it and talking about it. Love this one of my favorites from Julie Garwood. So definitely check out The Gift. All right, next up is another historical romance. So this is In Want of a Viscount by Lorraine Heath. This is the third book in her Chessmen Masters of Scoundrels series. This was a new release that came out in January or February of this year, and I loved it so much. Lorraine Heath is one of my historical romance queens. I talk about her books all the time. I have read majority of her backlist, only have a few books to go. This one's very slow burn and very character driven, which I love about her books. And here we are following an American heiress who travels to London with her family and is looking for investors for their business ideas. The heroine in here is kind of a tinkerer, or she likes to kind of mess around with how things work, build machines. She's kind of working on a typewriter. So she's always been kind of looked at as the odd one out because she'd rather talk about how things work, how things are built. And so she doesn't really fit in, but she does fit in with the hero because he totally understands her and gets her. And I love that about him. The hero in here has a huge backstory as well with his family and reasons for why he stayed away from women for years. And so in here they find one another and are pulled to each other. I just love it so much. Very much like sweepingly romantic vibes. Highly recommend. I love Lorraine Heath's books to pieces. I have a whole author guide to her books on my channel, so definitely check that out. I'll link it below as well. All right, another historical romance. Next up we have It Takes a Rake by Anna Bennett. This is part of her Rogues to Lovers series. I've really enjoyed this series, and one thing I like about them is that they take place outside of London, outside of ballrooms. They're set in this kind of like seaside kind of town, and they're away from society, away from the ton. They are just kind of like the average person, the average people living there, and so I love that. So in this one, the hero and the heroine were kind of rivals when they were growing up. They were both interning for his grandfather's business, which is an architectural firm. So I love in here that we have a blue stocking heroine. She is a architect as well. And so in here we see that when they were teenagers and kind of interning with his grandfather's shop, that they kind of fought for things, and the heroine always saw that the hero hated her. And so it was kind of this like bitter rivalry between them. And so now we cut 2 years later. The hero is actually back into town after moving away to London for a few years. His grandfather's going to be passing on the business to the hero, so he comes back to kind of take charge of that. And when he's there, the heroine is still working at the firm, and so there's this new kind of like competition thing happening in town for the best idea to be built. So the heroine wants to enter, and she also wants the hero's help because she's like, I have great ideas and I can think of all the things, but I'm not great at like the calculations and actually like mapping it out and kind of paying attention to all those finer details, but he is. So she ends up offering up a deal to him because she thinks that he is crushing on somebody in town, not realizing that he's actually crushing on her this entire time. But so she's like, hey, I'll help you out. Like, you want to become a rake and kind of impress this woman that you are interested in. Like, I'll start helping you out, turning you into a fake rake because women love rakes, and you can help me out with my business situation. And so it kind of goes from there. I love it in here because like he is so obsessed with her. He fell first many years ago, and so he just kind of goes along with it and is like, sure, I'll like spend all this extra time with you. So good. Like I said, if you want one set outside of London, outside of the ballroom, outside of society, highly recommend this book, this series. All right, next up is another historical fiction read. This is one of my favorites of the year. My parents are actually borrowing this copy right now, so I don't have it, but I'm going to put up the cover here. So this is Homegoing by Ya Jessie. I love this one. 2 pieces. I read it for a historical fiction readathon that I co-hosted in the fall, and it stuck with me so much. This book had been on my TBR for a while, and I'm so glad I finally got to it. This book is basically a family tree, a family's ancestry told through story. Basically in here, we're following 300 years with the same family. We start off in the 1700s in Ghana, where we're following these 2 half-sisters, and basically in here, both of their lives change around the same time. One of them is married off to a kind of wealthy Englishman and kind of lives a very different life than her sister, who ends up getting abducted and sold into slavery and then forced on a ship and taken over to the US. And so we see their very different lives. This book was really unique with the storytelling as well, because basically in here, each character only gets 1 chapter. So we see one of those sisters' chapters first, we see the next sister's chapter next, and then we go down the line in their descendants. So like one of their children each gets a chapter, that person's children, and so forth down the family tree. So with that, you get get a ton of history and a ton of dynamics to the storytelling and to the situations these characters are in. It's kind of like a collection of short stories where you're each getting somebody's story, but if you look at it from a whole, they all really connect and are just woven together so beautifully and masterfully. Like, the writing was amazing. I want to read more from this author because I believe this was their debut a couple years ago, and I know they have other books out now. I definitely want to check out more. This book was just so powerful, definitely stuck with you. Like I said, it starts off 1700s Ghana and we go all the way to present day in Harlem. Loved it so much. Highly recommend. Definitely heavy hitting, but I feel like that's going to be kind of the case with historical fiction books. Highly recommend if you haven't checked it out yet. The audiobook in particular was fantastic. All right, next up is a historical romance. So this is Isabel and the Rogue by Liana de la Rosa. This is the second book in her Luna Sisters series, and this one I really enjoyed, just like I did the first book. So this book and series has been set in London in the 1860s, and the whole series is following these three Luna sisters. So they are Mexican heiresses who fled their country to come to England. So in here we're following Isabel, and she is kind of the shyer, the more wallflower of the sisters. And so basically in here they see this as the perfect chance for her to be a spy, because she is already kind of on the outskirts of society, outside of the ballroom, kind of looking in. And so her handler kind of sees this as the perfect way for her to kind of spy on things. So around the same time she meets the hero, who's kind of living a double life as well and working for the Home Office. And so they end up kind of pairing together, and it goes from there. Highly recommend. I love this author's books so much. I read her books first when she was an indie historical romance author. Love this traditionally published series as well. Highly recommend. Both books are out now, and the third book comes out in August, and I can't wait. All right, next up is Define Out the Heart by Joanna Lindsey, which first up, just a moment for this cover. Like, isn't this the most stunning cover? It's one of my favorite Joanna Lindsey covers. I love the raised gold on here with her classic typography, and then the heroine on here is just stunning, and of course with Fabio as well. Can't go wrong with a Fabio clinch cover. This one I read at the beginning of the year because it was one of the Historical Hellions, the historical romance book club that I'm a co-host for. It was one of our reads. I think it was our December read, but the live show was in January, so I read it at the beginning of the year, and I love this one. So first off, it is classic Joanna Lindsey, and the cover alone, like I said, just pulled me in. This one is set in medieval times, and I loved in here how the heroine is so strong and such a fighter. Basically in here, the heroine is an heiress, and both of her parents have passed away. So she has these grand estates, a ton of land, a lot of fortune, and with that comes these fortune seekers who are trying to force her hand to gain access to everything that she owns. So people have been attempting to force her into marriages. And so in here, the beginning of the story starts off with the heroine putting herself in chainmail and going out to fight to defend her estate, which I loved. So you see in here that the hero and his crew have been hired by somebody who wants to abduct and force the heroine into a marriage to, again, gain access to all of her lands and fortunes. And so the hero is just kind of doing his job. He's like a mercenary. And so he shows up. And so you see him kind of do some sneaky ways to get invited into her estate or into her castle walls. And so from there, he ends up abducting her in the night. So along the way, the heroine wakes up, realizes what's happening, and kind of convinces the hero. She's like, this is so dumb. Why are you kidnapping me for somebody else to then give me to them? You're only going to get a little bit of money, but they're going to get all of my land and fortune. Like, I am worth so much more. So maybe we should just get married. So I love a feisty heroine, and I loved in here how the heroine was just sassy and feisty enough to kind of fight for herself. And she kind of made a deal because she's like, okay, somebody's going to marry me. Why don't I kind of have a say and have a choice in who that is? And so it kind of goes from there. This one was published in 1989, which sometimes reading these older historical romances, you kind of get into these kind of sticky situations and sticky spots with some of the content and story. But this one I feel like really held up, and I was surprised by how current some of the conversations and characters were in here. I just really love this one. Highly recommend. It's one that I would definitely recommend people checking out from Joanna Lindsey. Next up is The Prince's Bride by Charis Michaels. So this is part of her Hidden Royals series. This book was released earlier in the spring, and I really love this one. I feel like it is so underrated. I don't see too many people reading it or talking about it, and it is one that was just so cute and charming. So in this one, the heroine was betrothed when she was a baby to a French prince, but shortly after his family was exiled, and he kind of hasn't been seen of or talked about in years. So now it is present day for the heroine, and we see that somebody has kind of come along, a relative of the prince, the hero, has come along and kind of claimed that princedom and has decided that that betrothal still stands, and the heroine is going to have to marry him instead. But the heroine is not willing to do that, and so she's like, you know what, I need to go find this missing prince that I'm actually betrothed to, track him down so he can save me from this situation. So she does that and kind of goes on a journey, sets off to this forest to find this prince. So she ends up finding the hero, who is her betrothed prince, but instead he tells her that's not him. He has been living life as kind of this horse trainer, just living quietly in the woods, in the forest, just taking care of horses for wealthy clients. And so they kind of get pulled into one of their stories because of course he is hiding his identity, and it kind of goes from there. This one was just so so cute and sweet and charming. Like I said, so endearing. I love this one if you want kind of that isolated vibe of them in the forest together. So good, and has like a royal situation as well, which isn't always my favorite, but this one really worked for me. So yeah, definitely check out The Prince's Bride by Charis Michaels. All right, another historical fiction that I enjoyed this year is The Briar Club by Kate Quinn. So this is another one that I read for the Leave It to the Pros book club, the historical fiction book club that I co-host. This one was actually my first time reading Kate Quinn, and this one just really stuck with me, and I really enjoyed her writing and really loved this book. So this book has a bit of a mystery element to it as well, which I really appreciate. So basically in here, we're following this house or this home where a lot of different people live. So basically like a boarding house where a lot of women lived in the 1950s, and they had this Briar Club kind of situation as where the name of the title came from. So this one takes place in the 1950s in Washington, D.C., and we're getting the McCarthy era. So a lot of like suspicions and unease happening. This one as well has some murders that happen, which just like really pulled me in immediately to the story, and I just really enjoyed the characters. I love the writing in here. I love the like mystery element to the historical fiction. I really enjoyed this one, and it had me wanting to pick up more Kate Quinn books. All right, next up is Any Duke in a Storm by Amelie Howard. This is the 4th book in her Daring Dukes series. This is a historical romance series. This book released in January, so at the beginning of the year. I love this one so much. This whole series I feel like is underrated, but it is so good, especially if you want diverse characters, if you want diverse setting for where they take place. All the books in the series take place at sea, and they're just in these different countries, and we have a lot of diversity for the characters representation and all of those things. I enjoy this series a ton, and it just gets better and better. This is definitely my favorite in the series so far. So this is a high seas non-stop adventure. So in here, the heroine is a badass heroine who is posing as a pirate captain. So basically she has been a spy undercover for years, and so we see pirates and smugglers. We see her meeting the hero as well. Like I said, it all takes place on the high seas, just like high adventure, and just so much fun. We get so much amazing representation in here. I loved in here how the hero falls first, and he is the one who is more of a submissive in their relationship. So we get a lot of really fun like good boy moments in here from the heroine. Really love this one. It takes place in the Caribbean and just so good. Highly recommend. If you haven't checked out Amelie Howard's Daring Dukes series, definitely recommend because they are so good. Next up is The Mistress Experience by Scarlett Peckham. This is the 3rd book in her Society of Sirens series. I've read all 3 books. Book 1 and Book 3 are my favorites. This one came out earlier this summer, and I really enjoyed it. So in this one, the heroine is the most infamous harlot in London, and basically a month with her is up for auction to help her raise money for her and her friends and kind of the women's movements that they're doing. And so the hero has somebody win the auction for him so that he can have some time with the heroine, because he wants to make sure that when it comes time for him to get married, that he's going to be a good husband, a good lover to his future bride. And so he wants lessons because he's like, I realize I'm lacking in this department and don't know what I'm doing. Can you please help me? So first of all, I love the fact that the hero was the one who was kind of like, all right, I'm lacking in some of these areas, so I want to improve. And so I love that part just alone. And then from there, I love the forced proximity and kind of that isolation we get with him while she goes up to his kind of isolated estate and stays with him. And they have this kind of agreement and lessons. And I just love how the heroine is so open and just is willing to help him out. And then they fall for one another. It's so good. And I just loved these 2 to pieces. Highly recommend this one. It's one of the new releases of this year that, again, I feel like is underrated and not very many people are picking it up, but highly recommend. You could totally read this one as a standalone. Like, you don't need to read them in order to understand this story. So yeah, highly recommend The Mistress Experience by Scarlett Peckham. I love this author's historical romances. I think I've read all of her historical romances and I love them. Her indie, her traditionally published ones, both so good. All right, next up is another new release from this year. So this is How to Fall for a Scoundrel by Kate Bateman. This is the 2nd book in Her Majesty's Rebels series. So in this one, the heroine is a co-owner of a kind of private investigation company with her friends. So in this one, the heroine meets the hero, and he is a former con man who tells the heroine he has retired from being a thief and he wants to kind of do things right and help out her and her friends. So he wants to work at their kind of private investigative company with them. So he tells her that kind of being a former thief and kind of knowing all of those ways would really help him out with the job. So I really love this one. I love seeing them work together. I love to hear how the hero kind of weasels his way into working with her. It was just so much fun. Highly recommend it. It's actually shocking because a lot of historical romances this year that I enjoyed have the spy espionage element to them. And in previous years, I would have sworn that I don't enjoy those. So maybe I do, and I was just reading the wrong ones before. So yeah, highly recommend this one. I love Kate Bateman's historical romances. All right, and then the last one that I have is The Duke Who Despised Christmas by Scarlett Scott. This is an indie historical romance. It's a Christmas novella. I love this one though, 2 pieces. I love Scarlett Scott's writing. This one, I will say, it definitely has more of an emotional element to it, and some kind of heavy-hitting trauma to the story. story. Basically in here, the hero is a duke and he just kind of lives in his isolated estate. He lost his pregnant wife a couple of years back around Christmas time. There was a house fire and he was actually badly scarred from the event as well, like physically scarred. And so he has a lot of feelings towards Christmas, just kind of wants to be left alone and just in his own grief and misery. This is a class difference romance. So basically in here, the heroine is his new housekeeper that the hero's mother hired to kind of decorate and take care of his house. And so his mother plans to come visit him for Christmas. And so she hired the heroine to kind of decorate the house for Christmas time. And so the hero, when he first sees that the house is decorated for something that he doesn't want to celebrate anymore, he tries to fire the heroine, but the heroine tells him like, yeah, you actually can't fire me because your mother hired me. So technically she's my boss, you're not, I'm staying. And so he is super just like, what? And then also like pulled to her at the same time. So we see it kind of going from there. It is a class difference romance with age gap. Of course, that widowed, scarred hero. Like I said, the hero's past though does kind of come up throughout the story. Like he thinks about it a lot and it is still affecting him. So definitely some content warning in here for this one. I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it. This is The Duke Who Despised Christmas by Scarlett Scott. And like I said, it's a holiday historical romance novella that is on Kindle Unlimited. Highly recommend. All right, so those are all 21 historical reads that I loved this year. So that was historical fictions and historical romances. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I thought it was super fun to just kind of put them all together in one place. Definitely let me know in the comments if you read any of these. If you're going to pick any of these up, I would love to know. If you had any favorite historical fiction or historical romance reads of the year, definitely let me know that as well because I want all the recommendations all the time. If you want even more historical fiction or historical romance content, I have playlists for both, which I will put in the description of the video along with all the other videos I said I would put down there as well. Again, I just can't believe that we're to the end of 2024, so I hope that you've had an amazing holiday season and continue to have an amazing holiday season. Have a great start to 2025. Still can't believe it. If you want to leave me an emoji in the comments today to let me know that you watched this video, leave me a crown emoji since we have the princess bride and so that whole like royal vibe. This was just the one on top of the stack. So yeah, definitely leave me like the prince crown in the comments today to let me know that you watched this. If you haven't done so yet, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of my future videos, and I'll see you in 2025. Bye!